The sun had just begun its descent behind the thick tree line, casting long shadows across the forest clearing. Oliver, a former soldier turned wildlife rehabilitator, stood knee-deep in the shimmering lake, cradling a creature unlike any he'd ever seen. Its massive, gleaming wings, speckled with indigo and cobalt feathers, folded around its slender body like a second skin. Its head, crowned with tendrils that shimmered like liquid metal, had an expression of tranquil defiance, eyes the color of storm-tossed oceans. The creature's chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged breaths that suggested life was slipping through its fingers. "It's going to be okay," Oliver whispered, though his voice was thin, lost amid the chorus of nature. But he knew the creature was already on the brink. The wind carried the faint scent of the unknown, an electric tingle that spoke of another world. He gently laid it on the mossy ground, the fabric of his old military jacket draped across its back to ward off the chill. Then, as if the air itself had become alive, the being's eyes, a deep, liquid cerulean, met his. They were wide, the pupils dilated in a way that suggested something urgent, something more than gratitude. It was as if she had known him from beyond time itself. With a sudden, shuddering motion, the creature pushed herself up, her wings unfurling behind her like the raw beauty of a storm. They shimmered under the dying light, each feather sharp and serrated like the edge of a blade. The force of their unfurling sent ripples across the water, and the scent of ozone flared in the air. "Are you an angel?" Oliver whispered, his voice cracking. The being didn't answer. Instead, she raised a hand, and in that moment, Oliver's breath caught. Her hand was human-like, save for the jagged tips of her long, translucent fingers. She touched her chest, then reached for him, the gesture reaching past language, past culture, past understanding. But in that touch, the world seemed to stop. A flood of images and emotions surged through him. Vast galaxies spinning in eternal dance, an alien city afloat among the stars, eyes filled with both unyielding hope and deep, aching loneliness. And then there was pain, agonizing pain, sharp as the claws of the creatures that hunted her kind. Oliver was breathless, unable to tear his gaze from her face. Her expression had shifted, no longer that of a frightened, dying creature, but of a sovereign, fierce and regal. The realization washed over him. This was no animal. This was no mere wounded being. She was a princess from a realm that hadn't seen peace for eons, exiled from her home after the war, hidden among the creatures of Earth to protect her from those who would see her fall. And she had found him. "I saved you," he whispered, the tremor in his voice betraying the awe flooding his veins. The alien princess's lips turned upward, the faintest hint of a smile that spoke of gratitude and promise. Her wings, the embodiment of the sky's might, folded tightly as she stepped forward. The night around them had claimed the land, but before them, possibilities uncharted and unknown glittered in the darkness. The future, whatever it held, would no longer be a story written in the blood of silence. It would be a tale of salvation, of destiny intertwined, and of a man who once saved an animal, only to discover that it was the breath of a star, the last of an ancient lineage, and the only key to their salvation. And so the night stretched on, filled with whispers that spoke of war, unity, and stars that once shone bright. They would face it all, together. The evening deepened, shrouding the forest in moonlight that seemed almost otherworldly. The princess, whose name Oliver had yet to learn, stood beside him, her wings folded tight and shimmering as though the stars themselves were trapped in their feathers. The light flickered off her skin, the deep blue hue an iridescent reminder of the otherworldly nature she carried within her. "You saved me," she said, her voice resonant and clear, yet carrying an accent that was unfamiliar, like a song half-remembered. The wind stirred, pulling the smell of pine and lake water across the clearing, carrying with it the sharp tang of ozone. I didn't know who or what you were," Oliver stammered, his fingers still trembling. He knew this moment would change his life forever, but he had no idea how profound the ripple effect would be. His gaze traced the fine lines of her face, studying the nobility etched into her expression. She bore the weight of both royalty and exile, an untold story lurking behind every glance. "You're safe now," he said, though the uncertainty in his voice betrayed his attempt to sound confident. A bitter smile passed over her lips, and for a moment, she closed her eyes, as though savoring the warmth of the moment before reality pulled her back. "Safety is an illusion," she whispered. "It has always been fleeting, but what you have done, it has set things in motion that no one can stop." "What do you mean?" Oliver asked, the doubt in his voice still palpable. The story he had just glimpsed had been beyond his comprehension. He was no hero. He was just a man trying to make amends for the things he had done during his years of service. "I am not who you think I am," she continued, eyes locking with his. The silver in her eyes grew brighter, almost glowing with an inner light. "I am Vaelara, the last of the Aelori, a people who once bridged the worlds of the stars. My kind fell during the Void War, a war fought for power, for a future that never came. I am here now because I have nowhere else to go. And you, Oliver, have the power to save me and my people." A chill raced through him at the mention of the Void War. Memories of battles he'd fought, of the bloodshed and the nameless enemies, came back in flashes. The idea that this woman, and her kind, had been torn from the stars, lost to war, felt too grand, too impossible to comprehend. And yet, standing there, the story in her eyes and the ache in her voice seemed so real. "You want me to help you?" he asked, a thin edge of disbelief mingling with hope. Vaelara's eyes softened, the storm in them giving way to something warmer, something vulnerable. She stepped closer, her wings brushing the air and sending a pulse of energy that hummed beneath his skin. "Not just help," she said. "You are my key, Oliver. You have been chosen." His heart quickened as the weight of her words pressed down. The air grew dense, almost electric, and for the first time in years, a part of him felt alive, like the embers of a fire that had never completely died. But doubt loomed over him like a dark cloud. "But why me?" he asked. "Why choose me? I'm no one special. I'm just a man who made a bad decision." A brief flicker of anguish crossed Vaelara's face before she masked it with a determination that spoke of legends. "Your life, Oliver, is marked by the choices you made, both dark and light. That is why you have the strength to decide what path to walk, to bear the weight of destiny and defy it at the same time. You know what it is to be both savior and sinner. You have walked the edge." He swallowed, torn between disbelief and the whisper of courage that stirred in his chest. The world was bigger than he'd ever imagined, more connected and brutal than he'd ever known. The stars had been more than just distant, glittering lights. They were home to beings like Vaelara, lost and scattered. "I'll do whatever I can," Oliver said, the words surprising him as they emerged. Not just a promise, but a pledge that echoed somewhere deep inside him. "But what are we up against? Who did this to you?" A deep shadow flickered across Vaelara's face. "The Kral-Vor," she said, the name a curse that tasted of iron. "They are a power, ancient and relentless, who wish to rule what should never be ruled. They'll come for me, but they will come for Earth as well, and everything in its path." Silence fell over them, the weight of it pressing on Oliver's chest. A shiver of recognition passed through him, as if the universe had just reminded him of a truth he'd long forgotten. This was no longer just about survival. This was about hope, about stepping into something greater than himself, something that might be his redemption. And as Vaelara stood beside him, her wings now folded like the guardians of an ancient story, he knew there was no turning back. The battle for Earth had begun, and it would be fought in the quiet moments, the forgotten places, and within the hearts of those brave enough to fight against the dark. He looked at her, and for the first time, he truly saw her not just as a wounded creature, but as a symbol, a promise that the future could be reclaimed. And he would be there, by her side, whatever it took. The following days were a blur, a chaos of whispered meetings, stolen hours, and a heavy silence that hung over the forest like a shroud. Oliver had transformed his cabin into a fortress of secrets, where Vaelara's presence was both an anchor and a tremor. The world outside continued its ordinary dance. Birds sang in the morning, leaves rustled in the wind. But the air within the cabin felt charged, electric with a sense of urgency that both thrilled and terrified him. Vaelara had taken to training, her movements graceful and fluid, almost hypnotic as she adjusted to the unfamiliar gravity of Earth. Her wings, once folded and dormant, now stretched and flared with practiced precision. The moonlight would often find her standing at the large glass window that overlooked the lake, her eyes lost in the cosmos. Oliver watched her with a mix of awe and dread. How could something so beautiful be the last of a race so powerful? The princess wasn't just a survivor. She was a symbol, a remnant of something that once bridged the stars. And yet, as she stood there, with the shadow of her past pressing down on her, she seemed more mortal than divine. "Are you afraid?" he asked one evening, his voice cutting through the silence. Vaelara turned, her eyes dark and deep, but softer now, the tension in her face easing when she saw him. "Fear is the first companion of any who choose to fight," she replied. "And I have fought before, but now I am afraid of what I have become." Oliver frowned. "You're not alone. We'll figure this out together. You said the Kral-Vor are coming. Tell me more about them." She nodded, pulling the long, silken strands of her hair behind her shoulder as she settled down on the worn leather couch. Her wings drooped behind her like an old memory, the tips brushing the floor. "The Kral-Vor are not like the ones you might know from Earth. They are older than our star's birth, a hunger in the dark that has existed since before the galaxies were named. Their power is rooted in the void, an absence that consumes everything it touches. They sound unstoppable," Oliver whispered. "They are," she said, eyes hardening with the weight of her words. "But they can be outwitted. They can be broken, but only when they underestimate their prey. I know them. I know their methods. And I know their hunger." As if on cue, a sudden vibration rippled through the cabin, startling Oliver and drawing a sharp gasp from Vaelara. The lights flickered, and the windows quivered in their frames. The familiar drone of crickets and rustling leaves outside was swallowed up by an unnatural silence. "Did you feel that?" Oliver whispered. "Yes," Vaelara said, standing up, her wings unfurling to their full extent with a sound like the crackling of 100 thunderstorms. "They are here." The door burst open, and Oliver's instincts kicked in. He reached for the old shotgun he kept hidden in the corner, his fingers trembling as they wrapped around its cold, metallic frame. Outside, the darkness was alive, as if the night itself had turned to liquid and was oozing into the clearing. But it was not the night, it was the Kral-Vor. Shadowy figures formed from the nothingness, sharp and serpentine, their forms shifting like ink in water. The first of them lunged at Vaelara, an arm of tendrils that whipped like vipers. She spun, moving with an agility that seemed almost supernatural, her wings slicing through the dark and sending a shockwave that cracked the earth beneath her feet. "Oliver, get down," she shouted, but he couldn't move. The sight of her, fierce and defiant, was more breathtaking than anything he had ever seen. It was as though the stories of old had come to life, stories of heroes and beings forged from stardust. He fired, the blast from the shotgun roaring through the clearing. The creature screeched, a sound that ripped through the night and left a ringing in Oliver's ears. The shadow shuddered and fell, its form dissipating into a thin mist. But more were coming. Vaelara turned to him, her eyes wide with a mix of urgency and something softer, almost familiar. "Run," she said, breathless but unwavering. "You need to stay alive to help me finish this." "No," he said, the conviction in his voice shocking even him. "I won't leave you." The first wave of shadows surged forward, and Vaelara's wings became a blur of motion, a barrier between him and the horrors that sought to consume them. Oliver fought to stay on his feet, the shock of gunfire and the rush of fear making him feel like he was drowning. But in that chaos, he felt something shift, a thread of courage twisting through his veins. "We have to push them back, or we'll lose everything," Vaelara said, and for the first time, Oliver realized the full weight of what was at stake. He squeezed the shotgun tighter and nodded, a resolve forming in his heart. "Then let's fight." They were no longer just a man and an alien princess. They were the last hope, two warriors standing against the consuming void, fighting not just for their survival, but for a future that now seemed as fragile as stardust. The battle raged into the night, with shadows and wings clashing under the pale light of the moon, and the echo of forgotten legends whispered through the trees. The battle raged like a tempest, a cacophony of sound and fury that tore through the night. The Kral-Vor were no longer just shadows. They were shapes given form, elongated and cruel, their eyes glowing like twin suns that had gone mad. They surged forward, their forms dissolving and reforming in an eerie dance of malice. Oliver's heart pounded like a war drum, every muscle in his body straining as he fired round after round, trying to keep the creatures at bay. Vaelara was at the heart of the storm, her wings slicing the air and scattering the dark, whispering shadows like embers caught in a storm. Her movements were seamless, graceful even in the chaos, and each time her wings flared, a pulse of light erupted, momentarily illuminating the clearing in a ghostly glow. The creatures hissed and shuddered, recoiling from the brightness as though it burned their very essence. Oliver felt as though he were drowning in the torrent, each breath a battle against the suffocating grip of fear. He caught glimpses of Vaelara's eyes in the flashes of light, a kaleidoscope of determination, sadness, and something deeper, something that felt like a plea. "Oliver, move," she shouted, her voice cutting through the noise like a knife. A sudden surge of heat radiated from her, a shockwave that sent the nearest Kral-Vor sprawling, dissolving into smoky tendrils. He ducked behind a fallen log, heart hammering as he fought to steady his breathing. The creatures were relentless, but the light she wielded was a flickering beacon in the dark. It was the only thing that gave him hope. "Vaelara," he shouted, peering over the log to see her surrounded by a dozen more of the dark creatures. Their tendrils coiled like serpents ready to strike. The shimmer of her wings pulsed, but for a heartbeat, Oliver thought he saw her falter. The glow that had given them both strength dimmed. "No," he whispered, the words slipping from his lips like a prayer. Suddenly, she dropped to one knee, her wings folding behind her in an act of surrender. The creatures stopped, their grotesque forms shivering with anticipation. Oliver's blood ran cold. The clearing fell silent, save for the ragged sound of his breathing and the sinister, chittering noise that rose from the Kral-Vor. "Let me help you," Oliver said, fear tightening his chest. He wanted to run to her, to grab her, to tell her that he wouldn't let this end like this. But his legs felt like lead, frozen by the sight of the alien princess brought to her knees. Vaelara's eyes met his, and for a moment, the storm seemed to pause, suspended in time. "The Kral-Vor don't just want me, Oliver," she said, her voice barely audible over the hissing creatures. "They want what I carry. The essence of the Aelori, the light that bridges realms. If they take it, Earth will fall. You must run." "No," he said again, the word of defiance that burned through his fear. "I won't leave you." A flash of pain crossed her face, and she reached out a hand, her fingers trembling as they reached him across the distance. "You have always been brave, Oliver. That is why you were chosen." Before he could move, the creatures leapt forward, their forms blurring into solid shapes that lashed out with unholy speed. Vaelara's wings unfurled once more, but this time, they were not just a shield. They were a force, a final pulse of light that screamed of hope and despair. The clearing was filled with the blinding brilliance of that light, a flare so intense that the night seemed to split apart at its seams. Oliver shielded his eyes, but the raw energy that surged around him sent a shockwave that lifted him off his feet and hurled him into the woods. He crumbled to the forest floor, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and terror. The creatures were silent now, as though stilled by the brilliance that had radiated from Vaelara. He forced himself to his knees, the ground beneath him scorched and blackened, the air hot and sharp with the scent of smoke and ozone. "Vaelara," he called, his voice hoarse and desperate. A low, mournful sound came from deeper in the woods. He staggered to his feet, lungs burning with the effort as he pushed forward through the twisted underbrush. The night seemed to waver around him, every tree and leaf heavy with a strange, foreboding energy. He found her lying at the edge of the clearing, her wings sprawled out like fallen, shattered glass. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, A fragile smile touched her lips. "They are gone for now," she whispered, barely audible. "But they will return, and when they do, we will be ready." Oliver took her hand, rough and warm from the battle, and nodded. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on him, but so did the realization of what was coming. Whatever lay ahead, whatever dark tide threatened Earth, they would face it together. "I promise you, Vaelara," he said, voice firm, "we will be ready." A flicker of gratitude passed through her eyes, and then her gaze drifted to the night sky above, where stars now shone like diamonds in a velvet expanse. The silence of the forest felt less like an end and more like the beginning of something vast and incomprehensible. The storm within her and within him was far from over, but now they knew it was a storm they would face side by side. And when the dawn came, it would be a dawn of reckoning, a promise whispered between the stars. The sun rose with a hesitant stretch of light, casting long, wary fingers across the scorched earth. It was a dawn unlike any other, painted in hues of crimson and gold, as if the world were bracing itself for what was to come. Oliver sat beside Vaelara in the clearing, her head resting against his shoulder as the morning light traced the sharp planes of her face. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open to see him watching her. For a moment, silence reigned, charged with the knowledge that they were both changed. But in her gaze, there was no longer any fear, just resolve. "You stayed," she said, a smile playing at her lips. "Always," Oliver replied, the truth clear and unwavering. The past week had been a blur of preparation. Oliver had sent messages to those he trusted, enlisting their help and spreading word of what was to come. Vaelara had taught him what she knew, guiding him through rituals and sigils meant to defend against the dark tide. They had trained tirelessly, fighting shadows that would appear without warning, creatures that whispered their arrival like ghosts in the dark. Now, as the first rays of the sun kissed the forest floor, they both knew that the final battle was close. The Kral-Vor would not be kept at bay for long. Their hunger would not be denied. "They're coming," Vaelara whispered, her eyes scanning the horizon where the sky met the trees. A ripple of energy spread across her skin, blue light dancing like liquid fire. It made her seem otherworldly, as if she were more than flesh and blood, more than just a survivor. Oliver squeezed her hand. "We'll stand together, no matter what." A deep rumble reverberated through the ground, a sound that made even the forest pause. From the edge of the clearing, figures began to emerge, dark and insidious. Their forms were shifting, made of smoke and malice, eyes glowing with an unholy light. They came in waves, their tendrils reaching out as if drawn by some unseen force. But Vaelara stood, her wings spreading wide, each feather tipped with radiant light. The clearing glowed with the power of the Aelori, an energy so pure that even the sky seemed to pause, holding its breath. And then, Oliver stepped forward, his chest rising and falling with the weight of what was to come. He knew the time for doubt had passed. "Today, we fight not just for our survival," Vaelara said, her voice cutting through the chaos, amplified by the light emanating from her, "but for every life that could be stolen by the dark." The Kral-Vor hissed, a chorus of nightmarish screeches that cut through the air like razors. The world seemed to fracture, the forest quivering under the force of their presence. But Oliver was no longer afraid. In his chest, a new fire burned, a defiance that would not be quenched. He raised the shotgun, but it was not the weapon that made him strong. It was the bond between them, the knowledge that he was not alone. The first creature lunged, but Vaelara's wings flared and a brilliant burst of light erupted, sending it skidding backward, its form dissolving into ash. Oliver fired, and each shot found its mark. The clearing became a cacophony of sound, screeches and shouts, the crackle of power, and the roar of defiance. They fought, not just as allies but as a force that defied the dark. Vaelara was the spear, her wings a wall of light that cut down the shadows, while Oliver was the heartbeat of hope, holding the line and bringing the strength of humanity to the battle. Hours passed, marked only by the burning sky and the ever-increasing swarm of Kral-Vor. It felt as though time had lost meaning. But just as the last flicker of day began to retreat, Vaelara raised her head, her eyes locking with Oliver's. "It's time," she said, voice trembling but fierce. "We must strike at the heart." She darted forward, her wings a blur of luminescence, and Oliver followed, taking the space by her side. They reached the center of the clearing, where the very air seemed to twist, and there, the Kral-Vor coalesced into a shape, a towering, writhing beast of shadow, eyes burning like embers of a dying fire. Vaelara raised her hands, the light from her body flaring brighter than ever before. "This is for my people," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "This is for Earth." And then, she spoke the ancient words, an invocation of power so pure that the very fabric of reality seemed to shudder. The beast let out a roar that split the air, the force of it knocking Oliver to his knees. He watched as Vaelara's light became blinding, spreading like a ripple across the clearing, consuming the shadows and burning away the darkness. The final cry of the Kral-Vor echoed in the night, a sound that seemed to linger long after its form was reduced to nothing but ash. Silence fell, deeper and more complete than any he had ever known. The stars shone brighter, as if they, too, were exhaling after a long, held breath. Vaelara fell to her knees, the light dimming around her, leaving her as she was, a warrior who had given everything. Oliver crawled to her side, his hands shaking as he touched her arm. "You did it. We did it." Her eyes met his, and though she was spent, there was peace there. "You were my light," she whispered. "You showed me what I thought I had lost." The morning sun broke over the horizon, the first light of a new day. They sat there, surrounded by the quiet remnants of the battle, and for the first time, Oliver felt that the world was theirs to protect. He reached out, taking her hand in his, and they both watched as the forest stirred with the first whispers of life. The threat was over, but the bond they shared would remain, a testament to their defiance, their strength, and their love. The dawn had come, the storm was over, and the stars shone brighter, as if they, too, had hope once more.